This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 663 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. When an analyst says to avoid a player in fantasy football, they're generally saying to avoid that player at a certain cost. Every relevant player in fantasy is draftable at some point. It's just that in the majority of drafts or when analyzing average draft position, an analyst can generally say, you probably shouldn't draft this particular player this season. That's what today's episode's all about. You'll hear about 10 players to avoid in your fantasy football drafts this year. But with that caveat, you should avoid them at their current price tag. Like last week, I brought on a special guest to talk through these players. I talked to none other than Mr. Evan Silva himself. Evan's been around for a while, and everyone probably knows about him from his award-winning matchups column. He's now doing all of his work over on EstablishTheRun.com, and I always appreciate my fantasy football conversations with him because he approaches the game in a different way than I do. It's good to get a different perspective. So we'll get to that conversation in just a second, but before getting to our players to avoid, I did want to remind you about the Establish the Run Draft Kit. Establish the Run has rankings for any fantasy format you might be playing in, and they continuously update as news breaks. You also get access to Evan Silva's top 150, and along with it, a change log that you can read to see why players are moving up and down his draft board. It's a great way to make sure you understand why players are ranked where they are. The goal is to help you make better decisions, not tell you who to pick. And if you're into best ball drafting, their strategy, rankings, and insight can help you out a ton with roster construction. Establish the Run gives you a different perspective on fantasy football than I do. I think the combination of my work and theirs can help make this draft season a successful one. So head over to EstablishTheRun.com and purchase their draft kit. And when you do, use promo code JJ for a 10% discount. That's promo code JJ. Also, the moment we've all been waiting for has finally arrived. The Week 1 NFL Sunday Million is officially live on FanDuel. Showcase your NFL knowledge and construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap. Then follow along using FanDuel's live scoring feature to compete for your share of $3 million in cash prizes, including a cool $1 million to first place, all for just $4. The first Sunday of the NFL season is approaching quickly, so head to FanDuel and submit your lineups today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Now here's the conversation with Evan and me on players that we're generally avoiding this year in fantasy drafts. All right, Evan, we will do the exact same thing that Reeves and I did last week, just going back and forth with some guys that we aren't necessarily avoiding at all costs. Obviously, every player is okay at a certain price point, but just generally speaking at ADP, these are players that we're not drafting heavily this season. So why don't you kick things off with the first player that you're generally avoiding?
Yeah, going to start out strong here. Davante Adams is a player that I'm significantly lower than ADP on. First of all, Davante Adams just got paid. He's getting paid at an advanced stage of his career. When he's about to be 30 years old, he's nearing the age cliff for bigger wide receivers. There's obviously more target competition in Las Vegas than there was for Davante Adams in Green Bay. Hunter Renfrow is coming off a 100-plus catch year, and Darren Waller is one of the best receiving tight ends in the league. You look back at who Davante Adams was competing for targets in Green Bay with. We're talking about Allen Lazard. We're talking about him now all of a sudden as like a 5th or 6th round pick. People are talking up Randall Cobb and Amari Rodgers and, trying to prop up Robert Tonyan coming off this ACL. And that's what Davante Adams was competing for. That's who he was competing with in Green Bay. A lot more to compete with now in Vegas. And look, I think Derek Carr is a fine, above league average quarterback. And I actually liked Derek Carr in fantasy this year as a way of capturing all these weapons. But he's certainly a downgrade from Aaron Rodgers. And I don't even think that can be debated. So, I'm not taking Davante Adams in the first round, and he consistently goes in the first round. I've got him rated as more of like a mid to late second round pick.
Yeah, I agree with you. Overall with Adams this year, the other thing with what he did in Green Bay, obviously, Aaron Rodgers dictates this to some degree, but I was looking at Nathaniel Hackett's numbers as OC there when looking at and researching Russell Wilson this year, And over the last 3 years with Hackett as offensive coordinator, the Packers have had the second highest pass rate within the 5, so at the goal line, and they've had the most pass attempts at the goal line. Largely, obviously Aaron Rodgers loves to change it up and throw it around there, but that obviously has a huge impact on a guy like Davante Adams, which we likely will not see as much. And then you have Darren Waller there, who's a great red zone threat. So I'm with you. I think that anyone thinking that Davante Adams is going to have the same kind of magic in Vegas, maybe he's happier, playing with his boy. But at the same time, it's going to be tougher to put up the numbers that he was putting up. I'm going to shift things going from wide receiver in the early rounds to an early round quarterback. And this one's kind of weird to talk about because I like Josh Allen as the QB1. Josh Allen's my top ranked quarterback this year, came out number 1 in my projections. I have him ranked as the QB1 pretty comfortably, but this is more of a game theory thing above all else with Josh Allen. If you are looking at, if you're in a best ball draft or something, you can even sometimes get him in like the early 4th. That's fine. Late 3rd. I'm not even like totally against that because we usually see big drop-offs at running back and wide receiver, especially running back like in the mid 3rd, not just in ADP this year, but just historically we've seen that. And so I can understand, after that point in time, just kind of wanting to get that locked in QB1. But at the same time, in home league drafts, what you're going to see, and if you look at like Fantasy Pros aggregate ADP, Josh Allen's a 2nd round pick. And there's a huge opportunity cost in going that direction with Josh Allen whenever you're drafting him around a guy like Saquon Barkley, who could be a top 5 running back this year, Leonard Fournette, who saw a ton of work last year and is, has a decent enough outlook this year as well. There's just a really, really big opportunity cost there. Whereas if you look 3 or 4 rounds later, if you want to still get someone in that elite tier, you can get a Kyler, you can get a Jalen Hurts, you can get a Lamar Jackson, whoever, in that 6th round range. And it's a lot easier to swallow that opportunity cost than it is more in the 2nd round. So really this comes down to the fact that I would rather build out my elite running backs and wide receivers early. We've known historically, and we've seen historically that this drop off does occur when the running back dead zone hits. And you're not, and not only that, but in the running back dead zone, we often see high hit rates at wide receivers too. And so you're kind of getting past that point a little bit when you do end up getting a Kyler or a Jalen Hurts. Then obviously you can wait even longer if you want to and get a guy like Trey Lance or something, especially in a home league draft where he's probably going to go even later than where he goes in like a high stakes or a best ball draft. So to me, Josh Allen is my QB1. I understand why he's going as the QB1. He's very stable. I mean, like he should be the QB1 in fantasy football. It's just, I don't think the gap between him and a Kyler and a Jalen Hurts is nearly as significant as what ADP is showing.
Yeah, and you mentioned Josh Allen going the 2nd round of home league drafts. I mean, I see him going the 2nd round of FFPC, relatively higher stakes drafts.
Yeah.
Now, that can be fun when you start Stephon Diggs and then Josh Allen in like it's more of a tournament setting for FFPC. It doesn't make sense to take him in the 2nd round of a home league for sure. The second guy that I'm fading is Josh Jacobs, staying on with the Raiders. And I think a lot of points are going to be scored in the AFC West this year. So this is a little bit risky to be fading 2 prominent members of an offense that I do think is going to play well this season. But with Josh Jacobs, I mean, you just have a lot of red flags here, okay? The new Raiders regime, which comes from the Patriots, obviously has a long history of deploying 3 and even 4-man backfields at times. The Raiders went out and drafted 2 running backs. Samir White, I think, could be maybe just as good of a runner as Josh Jacobs right off the bat. I mean, he looked pretty good in the Hall of Fame game. Josh Jacobs played in the Hall of Fame game, which was a little bit of a red flag because I understand they wanted to get him some work behind the first-team offensive line. The first-team offensive line was out there, but Derek Carr wasn't playing. Davante Adams wasn't playing. And that was a little bit of a surprise. Maybe not as big of a deal as some people made it out to be, but certainly not. I mean, I would take it as a little bit of a red flag. The Raiders new regime did not pick up Josh Jacobs' 5th-year option. And I mean, I don't think it would be crazy if they got like a trade offer for him that they would absolutely be willing to part with him because this is not how the Patriots historically have valued running backs. They're not going to give him an extension. So too many red flags here. He always goes 2 rounds before anywhere I'm willing to take him.
Yeah, I'm with you too. He's dropped down my rankings basically week after week. He was never someone that I was like overly high on. And it's bizarre too, because like last season, he kind of had an underrated year, like statistically and in fantasy football.
Yeah.
He finally saw the target share that we've sort of been waiting for him to see. And he did so, and he played well during that second half, which is where you obviously want your fantasy assets to play well. But, at the end of the day, this is a brand new system, a brand new staff. And I agree with you that it's, there's a lot of risk with drafting Jacobs. And he's another guy who will go in the running back dead zone often, and he'll go in that running back dead zone area, especially in like home league drafts when people are reaching for running backs a little bit higher than what we typically see in some of the drafts that we're in. I'm going to go with a consistent theme here and go with another running back from that dead zone area who's also got a lot of new stuff going on around him, and that's David Montgomery. David Montgomery's fine as a player, but I think that right now within the fantasy space, people are making a lot of assumptions about his role in this offense. He's been good the last couple of years in fantasy, but last season, only Najee Harris had a higher snap rate than Montgomery at the running back position. 2 years ago, Montgomery was first in the NFL in snap rates. There hasn't been really that much competition for Montgomery when he's been healthy. But now we have this new front office. We have a new coaching staff in Chicago, and one that has no ties to David Montgomery. So I think just naturally, even if you think that there is still some influence to some degree, but naturally, they're going to look at David Montgomery. They're going to look at this backfield a lot more objectively than what a previous regime would maybe look at this backfield and how they would look at the backfield. And objectively, I don't know if David Montgomery is that much better than Khalil Herbert, really. I mean, last year, Khalil Herbert was better than Montgomery at gaining 20 plus yards in the rate that he was gaining 20 plus yards. He was better than David Montgomery in success rate. He was the only running back last year to rush for 100 yards against Tampa Bay. He's one of two over the last 2 years who has done that. The other one was Dalvin Cook. And my prospect model liked Khalil Herbert. It gave him the third best draft capital delta within his draft class, which is essentially saying that he was very undervalued as a prospect overall. And situationally, the Bears have one of the worst situations offensively in football right now. They have one of the worst offensive lines in football. They're probably not going to put up that many points. The weapons there are horrendous outside of Darnell Mooney and maybe Cole Kmet. So I just think that even if Montgomery were to be given the same workload and this high snap share and this bell cow workload and these looks, I don't know if he would even be that effective just given the offense and the situation that we're seeing the Bears in right now. So to me, if you're going to get a Chicago Bears running back, I would much rather prefer the upside and potential of Khalil Herbert late than going with David Montgomery in the early-ish rounds.
Yeah, I think Khalil Herbert is actually real good.
Yeah, me too.
And you mentioned the bad offensive line for the Bears. The Raiders are also at risk of fielding one of the worst offensive lines in the league. And that offensive line play can sometimes be overrated as it pertains to fantasy production, especially in situations where players are just going to hoard volume. Like, Najee Harris is the perfect example of that. He can still be quite productive in fantasy despite playing behind a really bad offensive line. Another really bad offensive line is in Seattle. And Brandon Thorne just issued his rankings to establish their own. Brandon Thorne, probably the best offensive line analyst in media right now. And all these offensive lines that we're talking about here are very, very low in his rankings. That includes Seattle. Seattle couldn't even get first downs last year with Russell Wilson out there for most of the year. Now we think they're going to get first downs with Geno Smith and Drew Lock. I mean, this is like a legit concern to the extent that I think that, there could be like frustration on the part of a lot of players in Seattle this year because this quarterback situation, I mean, it's an absolute joke. It's an absolute joke. And so my fade here is DK Metcalf. And gosh, I mean, he's a big time talent, but he also had, a big time, one of the best deep ball throwers of the past 10 years as his quarterback since entering the league. That's going to change in a hurry here. And it's going to be so ugly. I almost want to fade the entire Seattle offense. Tyler Lockett sometimes gets to a place in drafts because he's going so late that I'll take him. But DK Metcalf is, I think the production is going to plummet here.
Yeah, you don't want to use situation as like the foundation for fading a player or not drafting him at ADP, especially when it's such a talented guy like DK Metcalf. I think we'd both agree he's a great wide receiver, right? He's a monster. The problem is the situation really is that horrific. I mean, even last year, I think a lot of people are going to look at the splits with Geno Smith and without Geno Smith last year for Metcalf. And in the 3 games, I mean, DK Metcalf was fine. He was like a wide receiver 1 in 2 of those 3 games. The problem is Seattle's offense had 6 total offensive touchdowns in those games, and DK Metcalf accounted for 50% of those. And there's no chance it's going to be sustainable or be sustained across the entire season. So I'm with you on DK Metcalf. A lot of agreeing here, but that's sort of what happens, whenever we're studying this stuff and looking at this stuff, is that you're probably going to come to some agreement overall. I'm going to shift from DK Metcalf and that horrible Seattle situation to one that is a kind of a weird one. I don't love Antonio Gibson this year, even though I like him, as a player overall. I thought that last year there was at least a chance that they would start to use him more as a receiver. We saw that from him in college. He came out as a wide receiver from Memphis. I'm a sucker for the Memphis guys for sure. I mean, they're just these uber athletes who are just really fun to watch, and they're electric when they get the ball in their hands. But with Antonio Gibson, we thought that as this offseason started, J.D. McKissic goes over to Buffalo, and we're like, wow, this unleashed Antonio Gibson. All of a sudden, Antonio Gibson, year 3, this is going to be it. And then McKissic does that 180, comes back to Washington. Oh, well, there's a 15% target share from last year that is now getting funneled over to McKissic. And then in the draft, Washington goes out and they take a day 2 pick and select Brian Robinson, who, I think Gibson as a player is better than and more electric than Brian Robinson is as a player and as a prospect. But, at the running back position, we have to understand that a lot of this production in fantasy comes down to coaching decisions. And if the coaching staff sits there and they say, Gibson played injured throughout last season. He was injured. He's been injured throughout his career so far in the NFL. We want to hold him back a little bit, keep him fresh. Then they could throw a guy like Robinson onto the field who has a 3-down skill set. I mean, look, he was buried behind some really, really good talent at Alabama, finally got his call last year, and he was good last year. But even when he was playing with really good talent at Alabama, he was still seeing some work in that backfield at times, and he was, used as a receiver at times too. And so I do think that Brian Robinson has a 3-down skill set, and, it's just worrisome with a guy like Gibson who is already losing receiving work to one of the better pass catching backs who's become one of the better pass catching backs in football in J.D. McKissic. And there's already reports now that Brian Robinson could see short yardage work and maybe goal line work from Antonio Gibson. Then all of a sudden, if Antonio Gibson's just an early down between the 20s guy, that is exactly what you don't want in fantasy football, that kind of player. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, there are some sites and some places where you're drafting where Gibson falls enough where he becomes an okay enough value. It's fine. But in home league drafts and in the aggregate ADP that Fantasy Pros has and stuff, he's still like a late 3rd round pick. And that's absurd to me. I mean, it's way too high for a guy who's locked into a backfield committee. And I haven't even mentioned that Ron Rivera, the coach himself, comped this Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson dynamic to what we saw with D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart back in the day when Rivera was in Charlotte and coaching the Panthers. So, I just think that there's a lot of downside with Gibson. He's just like a classic dead zone back at this point, and I'm having a hard time drafting him.
Speaking of split backfields, I'm going to stay in Seattle with another fade, Kenneth Walker, the rookie out of Michigan State. Really good runner at Michigan State. Not very much of a receiving profile, number one. Number two, he's got to deal with Rashad Penny. And Rashad Penny was one of the best running backs in the league down the stretch last season. The Seahawks rewarded him with a pretty good deal. 1 year, over $5 million, $5 million flat guaranteed. That's a pretty good deal for a running back these days. And I mean, he earned it. And in Seattle, they're very big on like guys that earn roles. Like it doesn't matter if, hey, were they the most recent 2nd round pick? Like Rashad Penny was a really good back down the stretch last year, and he's going to play. And so is Kenneth Walker. And they've already talked about using DJ Dallas and or Travis Homer in receiving situations. So we're cutting off the head of the receiving capability of both Kenneth Walker and Rashad Penny. We're talking about an offense that we're worried that they're going to get first downs, not touchdowns. We're not even talking about touchdowns. We're talking about moving the chains 10 yards downfield. Okay? So you can sit here and say, listen, the Seahawks, they love to run the ball. Let's draft their running backs. But a little bit closer, zooming in a little bit more on this situation, and there are a lot of ways, like a lot of potential games for, Rashad Penny to have 11 carries for 65 yards and Kenneth Walker to have 9 carries for 52 yards and they could even average like a very high yards per carry, like those numbers would, and you're still getting nothing from them in fantasy because they're not catching passes and they're not scoring TDs.
I'll tell you what, Rashad Penny managers, I mean, I had Penny on playoff teams last year and I loved it, right? It was amazing, especially during championship week. But we should be very, very pleased with the fact that he had like a 6.3 yards per carry last year because he had 8 targets last season, Rashad Penny did, because this is the way that Seattle uses their running backs. And it's frightening to think that, you mentioned the Kenneth Walker receiving numbers from college. I don't know if it necessarily means that, and I talked about this like all offseason, during prospect time and such, but I don't know if it necessarily means that he's incapable of catching passes. I just think it's a red flag just in terms of we don't know if he can. And not only that, but usually from college to pros, when guys do catch a few passes, it's a sign of talent because in college, they're just peppering their best players constantly with the ball as much as they possibly can, including, using them in like the return game, right? Because they just want their best players to have the football in their hands. So when these running backs don't get the ball through the air, it's not just a sign of, oh, maybe they're not that good of a receiver. It's also a sign of what if they're not as talented as we might think. So there is some signal there, and that's worrisome with Walker. But then on top of that, if he's not that much of a receiver, then it's just a redundant asset to Rashad Penny. And that's just a fantasy football nightmare, behind probably a bad offensive line on one of the worst, probably the worst offense in football entering the season from a projection standpoint. All right, I'm going to move on. This is probably the one player that I'm most fearful to talk about today because I'm most fearful that he could own me, at season's end. I love him as a player. I've backed him for years as a player. It's Deontay Johnson. The reason I am worried about Deontay Johnson, and first off, I've been the opposite of someone who said that he's inefficient and bad because he's been so inefficient within the Steelers offense. I think situationally, things just look a lot different and rough for him this year. The way the Steelers offense has operated over the last couple of seasons is you've had this statue under center in Ben Roethlisberger, this makeshift offensive line. And so what they've done is Ben Roethlisberger was consistently first in time to throw. He would just get rid of the ball really quick. And that would allow a guy like Deontay Johnson to run these slants and just catch the ball quickly, and generate, his yardage and such that way. When you have a low average depth of target, you're not going to be able to generate great efficiency numbers. Same thing happened with Juju. Juju had a 6.0 ADOT the last healthy year that he had with the Steelers. You're not going to be able to generate a lot of efficiency with that low of an ADOT unless you're like Percy Harvin, right? So with Deontay Johnson, I'm worried about this shift with the Steelers going from Ben Roethlisberger to these other quarterbacks, not just in terms of like just passing volume, but yeah, it plays into passing volume because the last couple of seasons, last 2 years, the Steelers have been second in the NFL in passing volume behind only Tampa Bay. And so we're going to see a more conservative Steelers offense more than likely. And I do think they have a good enough defense to be able to keep game scripts at that pace and play that way. Whereas other teams like Seattle, who want to be run heavy, may not be able to because they're going to be trailing in games. Mike Tomlin's never had a losing season in the NFL. And so we know that generally speaking, the Steelers are going to be good enough to be able to stay in games. And so we could see a more run heavy approach. And that scares me a little bit. The other thing that scares me a little bit is this Matt Canada offense wants to get his quarterbacks out of the pocket. They roll out a little bit more. They just haven't been able to do these kinds of things with Ben Roethlisberger. What do? They get Mitch Trubisky, a mobile quarterback. They draft Kenny Pickett, a mobile quarterback. These guys who can work within this offense and within this structure a lot better than Ben Roethlisberger could. I think that could buy a little bit more time and allow a guy like a George Pickens on the perimeter, Chase Claypool even in the slot getting down the field, allowing them to do a little bit more damage within this offense. And then Pat Freiermuth still exists. Najee Harris is a good threat out of the backfield. I love Deontay Johnson. I would still be buying him in Dynasty, and I would love to have him in Dynasty long-term, all that good stuff. I'm just very concerned about what might happen here in 2022. And I haven't even mentioned that if Kenny Pickett ends up playing for Pittsburgh at some point this season, rookie quarterbacks are bad for wide receivers in fantasy historically. So that's just another mark against, really anyone in this offense, but Deontay Johnson in particular, because Johnson's the one who's going a lot higher than anyone else in fantasy drafts right now.
Yeah. And I presented a very similar case to Matt Harmon when we had him on the Establish the Run show, as you did, for why I was fading Deontay Johnson. I still largely am. But he had a very interesting response, and that was that consider for a moment that Ben Roethlisberger was actually holding back Deontay Johnson.
Yeah.
That Deontay Johnson is actually a lot better than what he showed with Ben Roethlisberger because he can do a lot more stuff than run, a little 4-yard comeback route and have like a 5-yard ADOT and just rack up catches. So that's just the one, and I'm on your side, but that's the one interesting devil's advocate point that's out there that I had not previously considered, but Matt made a pretty substantial argument for.
I think Harmon's right. Like, I do. I think that Deontay Johnson is an incredible wide receiver, like way undervalued. His new contract was ridiculously team friendly. I don't disagree with Harmon. I think that, though, when you look at the situation in general for Deontay, he should probably be being drafted a round later than where he's being drafted right now. He should probably be going in like that Bateman, Darnell Mooney range or something rather than going, where you can get like the Allen Robinsons who have those like crazy touchdown upside and such this year. Whereas Deontay just doesn't have that in this offense. I mean, this offense is probably going to be at least maybe just as good as last year, but maybe even a little bit worse the way that the quarterback situation is. So that's my fear with Deontay. I think that there's those situational things for sure. And then there's also George Pickens might be, apparently George Pickens is a god. So we'll see how that goes too.
I know, right? Jeez. They could have a fun receiver core with, a 3-man musical chairs at quarterback. Although I don't really think that this Mason Rudolph talk is real.
Yeah.
My last guy to fade is Matthew Stafford. And that's because partially, or at least in large part, I would say, because of these elbow concerns that have been popping up during training camp, they are allowing him to throw. So I think that if they were truly worried that he might not be ready for, some in-season time, then then they wouldn't be letting him throw at all. And I think that that he's going to start in week 1. It's just, we've seen him deal with back injuries over the course of time, and he just doesn't bring enough to the table. He's coming off a great season, man. I mean, he was really, really good last year, but he just doesn't bring enough upside to move the needle at the quarterback position, even when he is 100%. So now add this extra layer of injury, and he's just someone that I really want no part of at this point. And I believe that there's a 4-man tier at the start of the first round: Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, Jonathan Taylor, and Christian McCaffrey, in whatever order you want to spin them. I've thought about moving, and I've Christian McCaffrey number 1 right now, and Cooper Kupp number 2. I've thought about moving Kupp to number 4 in that tier, just to sort of address some risk, to bake out some risk, and move him into the number 2 receiver spot behind Justin Jefferson. I don't know. What has your reaction been so far to the Matthew Stafford elbow stuff?
Well, the thing is, I was actually fading Stafford even before this stuff started. Stafford, there's a lot of quarterback-related marks that I look at that do not favor Matthew Stafford entering this year. His highest touchdown rate of his career last year, that generally regresses a little bit. The Rams themselves scored 80% of their offensive touchdowns through the air last season, which is another number that generally will regress to the mean year over year. Obviously, he's good. Obviously, the offense is strong and the scheme is strong for him to be, a viable enough fantasy option. But it's not like he was this like undeniable starter last year in fantasy. It's because of what he does and how he plays. He's a pocket passer. And so if you're not getting that juice, with a quarterback's legs, it's just, you need that player to have some sort of outlier type season, whether it's volume wise, like we saw with Tom Brady last year, or whether it's efficiency wise and how the team scores touchdowns, which is what we saw with Matthew Stafford last year. But even Stafford wasn't there yet. It's the same argument that you can make with like Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow had one of the best yards per attempt averages of all time last season. And he still, was like a QB 10 in points per game. This is the way that fantasy football operates, and we play within the rules. Like this is what we have to do, and we have to recognize that the rushing component is just so important at quarterback. So to me, since Stafford's sort of at the top of that tier where he goes, with Derek Carr and maybe a Kirk Cousins or something like that, I would just rather get the Derek Carr or Kirk Cousins a little bit later than paying up for Stafford, unless I'm in a, best ball situation or something where I'm trying to stack these guys and I get like a Cooper Kupp early and an Allen Robinson early. I think, going with a Ram stack is obviously fine because the Rams are good offensively, but that's my general thought on Stafford.
Like it.
I'm going to finish things off here. One more guy, TJ Hawkinson. I can't understand TJ Hawkinson's ADP right now, not only because of just where he goes generally, but I think Dallas Goedert should be drafted ahead of TJ Hawkinson at this point. At the tight end position, generally speaking, you want difference makers. Like, you need a top 3 tight end for it to really, really matter in fantasy football. And I don't know if Hawkinson necessarily has that in him. He's averaged no more than 12.1 points per game through 3 years. That happened last year where he was the tight end 6 with that score in full PPR. Now, if you look at this Lions offense, you have more bodies in the offense with Amon-Ra St. Brown's emergence. DJ Chark's apparently lighting it up right now. Potentially Jameson Williams coming back halfway through the season. You have DeAndre Swift in the backfield. It's really interesting to me, and I talked about this really all offseason, but it's really interesting to me how Amon-Ra St. Brown just goes absolutely ballistic down the stretch last year. And everyone's response is, oh, it's because TJ Hawkinson and DeAndre Swift were out. You're like, yeah, sure. I understand that's part of the reason why he was able to hit like such a high ceiling in terms of target share. But why would we expect an offense to run through a running back and tight end in that passing game as opposed to a really effective rookie slot guy who's probably only going to get better, right? It just doesn't make that much sense to expect TJ Hawkinson to be this dude when we have more evidence of him not being that dude, whereas Amon-Ra St. Brown showed us that he's kind of a beast. So if you look at the situation overall, we don't know for sure if TJ Hawkinson even has that elite status in him, and his situation just isn't that great, right? I mean, he has a lot of other pass catchers to deal with there. But on top of that, he's got a lot of bad going for him from a historical ADP front. On episode 657, I covered breakout tight ends and a process for finding breakout tight ends, but there's a lot of historical ADP trends that just don't favor Hawkinson. Historically, breakout tight ends, so tight ends drafted after round 5, that's how I've defined it. But breakout tight ends, they generally have a good quarterback associated with them. It's good to find tight ends who have good quarterbacks. And the logic that I've used as to why that's the case is that good quarterbacks, and this is all by ADP, so good quarterbacks by ADP, but good quarterbacks by ADP are generally just better quarterbacks, and better quarterbacks are able to get through their reads faster. They can get to the tight end position quicker, right? And so that's why tight ends in these offenses are able to thrive a little bit more. But then on top of that, TJ Hawkinson's not the top pass catcher from his team by ADP. That's another bad mark. So he's a bad quarterback in Jared Goff by ADP, and he's not the top pass catcher by ADP either, with Amon-Ra St. Brown being drafted ahead of him. Since 2011, we've had 19 tight ends drafted between rounds 6 and 9, so middle round tight ends who were not their team's first pass catcher, and they had a quarterback drafted after QB 16. So they're not the team's top pass catcher, and they have a bad quarterback. Of those 19 tight ends, only one of them exceeded ADP expectation by 3 or more points per game. It was Zach Ertz way back with Carson Wentz when he was a middle round tight end. He was able to get a lot of volume and break out that way. TJ Hawkinson, there's just a lot working against Hawkinson this year from an ADP historical front, from a competition on his own team front. I just have a really hard time drafting him. Do you agree?
I mean, after that rant, I don't think anybody is going to be drafting TJ Hawkinson.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Evan, my man, appreciate you hopping on the show to give some of your takes on players that you're avoiding. For anyone not following Evan and his work, make sure to check out EstablishTheRun.com and follow him on Twitter at Evan Silva. I'm on Twitter as well, at LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com. You can purchase the draft guide, which is now up to almost 200 pages. You can join the Late Round Fantasy Patreon, subscribe to the free newsletter. Check it all out, LateRound.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. Really appreciate it. I'll talk to you later in the week.